Okay, welcome everyone. Let's go ahead and kick things off and get started. Welcome to our educational webinar series presented by DataSource Consulting, an EXL company. We're very excited to have you here. And our mission here is to provide you education and learning around enterprise data management and analytics. That's the goal. So this is all about you, and we hope that you will submit any questions that you have. There's a little questions box on your dashboard. Feel free to enter a question at any time. We'll take those at the very end. This presentation is about 30 minutes, and we've also incorporated a demo. So that's something that is new that we haven't done before. So, you know, fingers crossed, you know how demos go. But we're hoping that it will go well. So we're excited to share that with you as well. So quickly, a little bit about DataSource Consulting, who we are, and really why we're experts in this space. So we're a consulting firm, and we focus exclusively on enterprise data management, modern data warehousing and architectures, including cloud and hybrid cloud, and decision intelligence. And in decision intelligence, it would include advanced predictive analytics as well as machine learning and robotics. So all things data, end-to-end solutions. And we do that by providing both strategy as well as implementation types of services. Under strategy, you would find things like data governance that address people, process, and technology, roadmaps, vendor tool evaluations, health checks around your data environment, vendor tool selection support, etc. And then in implementation, we have the engineers, the architects, the BAs, all the doers that roll up their sleeves and really collaborate with your team to help get things done. So that's a little bit about DataSource, and as you can see at the bottom, I think this is really true. We're passionate about data and your success, so that's one of the reasons why we do these educational pieces. Next slide, please. With that, I'd like to introduce your presenter today, Greg Meehan. He is a 13-year veteran in BI, decision intelligence, and data warehousing solutions. He's highly skilled in performance tuning, dimensional modeling, ETL, OLAP, tabular, and SQL Server relational databases. So we're very excited to have Greg with us today. And, you know, just as a side note on the bottom there, he's also very familiar with Agile as well as waterfall methodologies for implementation. So if you have any of those questions as it relates to tabular types of solutions, feel free to ask those questions. I'm your host today, Deborah Langer, and you know, I'm all about client success and making sure that this webinar goes well. So welcome everyone, we're excited to have you here, and with that, let me pass the baton over to Greg.
Thanks, Deborah. So I wanted to start by saying, you know, really the purpose of this webinar is to share our practical experience from implementing SSAS Tabular Cube. The intended audience is IT decision makers and BI developers who are not familiar with tabular cubes, and hopefully this will give you a really good idea of what to take into consideration if this is a tool that might be on your radar. I want to start with an introduction of BI and where Microsoft fits in specifically with this solution. I'll give you an introduction to tabular cubes. We'll talk a little bit about the pros and cons, what it can do well, what it can't do well. We'll highlight who are ideal candidates for tabular models and vice versa. And then we'll get into some design considerations that we've learned standing up these solutions. Then I'm going to do a demo so you can actually see the tool in action. And then we'll have a conclusion and then a Q&A session.
Excellent.
So what is BI? You talk to 5 different people, they'll give you 5 different definitions. I'm starting here with the Wikipedia definition. BI comprises the strategies and technologies used by enterprises for the data analysis of business information. In this context, it's fairly limited to the presentation layer that includes self-service and gold standard reporting. We consider it a single version of the truth, and it ensures consistency, conformity, accuracy, and speed. So to make it a little bit more, clearer, here we have the entire environment, you know, from acquisition to presentation. Sometimes when people refer to BI, they're referring to all of this. Well, today, specifically with Microsoft's Analysis Services tool, we're really just referring to that presentation layer between your dimensional model and your users actually accessing reports. So the BI landscape. There are a lot of great BI tools that have been out there. Some are new, some have been around for years, and they all do certain things very, very well. They'll tell you, their sales teams and their white papers, that they can do everything well, but we found that's not the case. And what I wanted to highlight here was that data source is not a Microsoft shop. This is not an advertisement for Microsoft. This is simply our this is what we've learned implementing these tools. But if we see, in your case, that Cognos would be a better fit, we'll recommend Cognos and help with that, or Tableau. This is simply a very candid discussion of what you need to take into account to have a successful implementation with SSAS Tabular cubes. So why Microsoft? You saw that big long list. You've seen those names. You've seen MicroStrategy. You've seen Tableau. Well, Microsoft has been a leader in the BI space for some time, and it's continuing to make investments, and it's continuing to improve, and it's continuing to get recognized. In 2017, you can see Gartner's Magic Quadrant. Microsoft is really kind of running away from the pack, and that was largely due to some additional BI technologies they released called Power BI, which I might get into a little bit. But the moral of the story is that Microsoft is big time in this space now, and you can have a very large enterprise data warehouse BI solution with Microsoft, and it's light years ahead of where it was just several years ago. So you might have some people on the line who are thinking, I just don't consider Microsoft big time. I'm here to say that if you do it right, Microsoft is absolutely worthy of consideration. So let's talk a little bit about Microsoft semantic layer tools. On the left, we have Tabular. That's really what we're going to talk about today. And this is Microsoft's latest semantic layer offering. It was initially released with some good but not complete capability in 2012. So it's been around for a few release cycles. They continue to add some really nice functionality, and all the literature is implying that they're going to be doing plenty more of that in the future. So it's based on relational modeling constructs. It's completely different from its predecessor technology, OLAP cubes. It's a completely different architecture, and in terms of relational modeling constructs, and we'll demo this just a little bit, but it's really much more like what a database developer would be used to. We're talking about tables and columns and key relationships, and I think database developers will find this to be quite a bit more intuitive than an OLAP solution. One of the things I really want to highlight, it's really the most important point about this technology is that it's completely memory-based. There's a way you can run it not all in memory, but it somewhat defeats the purpose. Because it's memory-based, you're going to need a lot more memory than you potentially had before, depending on your data sizes. But it allows you to have such great query performance with virtually no performance tuning, and that's a really big deal. Not all BI departments have the expertise to be able to really properly tune an OLAP environment, and there's administration involved with doing that I'll talk about down the line a little bit. It uses columnar storage, and that allows for some tremendous compression ratios. Everyone always asks, so what's the compression factor going to be? And there's really no hard and fast rule. It might be 10 times. If your data doesn't have a lot of cardinality, it could be 20 times or more. It could be less. Really, you're going to have to experiment. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it is highly compressed. So if you have a 1 terabyte data warehouse, you shouldn't fear that you're going to need a terabyte of RAM. It's not that daunting. So this is one of the things we're really going to highlight today, and that's that it's optimized for a new language called DAX, Data Analysis Expressions. And it's completely different from SQL. It's completely different from MDX, which is what we used for OLAP solutions. And we're going to look at that quite a bit today. I will do a demo of some DAX. We'll create a calculation in a cube so you can kind of get a feel for what that looks like and how familiar or unfamiliar it is. It's really one of the things I want to highlight here. I really find that Microsoft has presented DAX as being a little bit simpler than it is, and I suppose I'll let you decide after you have a chance to see it. The other thing we want to highlight is, this is Microsoft's latest offering. Like I've mentioned, it's the one receiving the investment. So if you're looking at a Microsoft semantic layer tool, they're not really putting the resources into OLAP. OLAP is still a good tool. I've been a part of many successful implementations. And companies run their businesses off OLAP tools. The point of this is not to disparage OLAP. It's merely to say that Tabular can do things that OLAP simply can't. So I don't want to belabor the point, but just for a little contrast, because my demo is going to do a little bit of contrasting from a query perspective. OLAP cubes are they're based on OLAP constructs, so dimensions and measures. It is a very different way of thinking about setting up a database than a conventional relational database. They're disk-based, which is nice because disk is inexpensive, but it's not nice because it's not as fast as memory, obviously. It's optimized for MDX. We'll see just a little bit of that today in our demonstration. It is feature-rich. This is one area where Tabular hasn't caught up. If you have complex relationships, let's say you like to extend it with custom assemblies, those are things that are either difficult or impossible in Tabular for the time being. It's a mature technology. Companies have been running their businesses using OLAP databases for years, and it can handle very large data sets. And that's, again, another limitation that I think you should really consider when you're evaluating if SSAS Tabular is right for you. So pros and cons. This is based on our experience and not necessarily what the Microsoft white papers say. So we have found that the development time is quicker than, for example, an OLAP tool. And we found that the query responses are tremendous, especially for certain things. If you've got reports that require distinct counts, I think you'll find that this is going to exceed even high expectations. And one really critical point here is that there's no special performance tuning for queries at the instance level. So in the OLAP days, you would have to have an expert look at server settings and do a whole bunch of custom configurations, and then you'd have to profile query data, and you'd have to have custom aggregations. There's none of that in this case. It's all happening behind the scenes. So the maintenance is minimal, but it's not a panacea. One of the things to take into consideration is we found that there was definitely a lack of documentation compared to SQL and even OLAP. So that's a challenge for people. And a lot of the documentation that's out there is really more geared towards PowerPivot, which was a predecessor technology I'll talk a little bit about, and not necessarily to analysis services. So you have to do a little bit of guesswork to make the same formulas they put out there work. And then this one I want to highlight because this is something that I think Microsoft doesn't necessarily give people enough heads up on, and that's it. Depending on your data structure, there can be a much longer processing time than you're used to. And if you've got really tight SLAs, that's going to require a lot of work optimizing your processing architecture so that you can continue to meet the SLAs. Yeah, the queries are lightning fast, but the work has to get done at some point, and that work really gets done at processing time. We'll talk a little bit more about that. It requires more memory, and not all departments have the resources to be able to have a 256 gig of RAM server, or have a cloud box with enough memory. That's definitely something that has to be taken into consideration. And then I mentioned this before, but there really is less native support for complicated or for complex relationships and time intelligence. So you're going to have to utilize the DAX language quite a bit more, and there are implications, and we'll talk about those. So who would benefit from Tabular? One of your pain points is that you don't have fast enough query performance. Obviously, your ears should perk up at this. That was something that we were really impressed by in every single implementation I've done. The queries have been lightning fast, even at a very granular level. It's got easy ad hoc querying, and that's from right within from Microsoft Excel. And if you think about it, how many times have you stood up a BI solution and the first thing somebody asks you is, how do I export it to Excel? Well, it's all right there, and I'm going to include a little bit of that in the demo today as well for some of the people who aren't using that as a user interface. If If you do need standard enterprise class features like integrated security, row level security, and so on, it does have that. So, this is a real enterprise grade BI tool. You have to have hardware that supports the data size. So you need to have the CPU and the memory to be able to handle this. If you have a small BI team and they don't have a lot of experience building cubes, this could be a good option, because the learning curve altogether really is less than with OLAP, and the maintenance is less than with OLAP, particularly from an administrative perspective. Setting it up, it's more comfortable, and I'll get into that, but it's better. And then I think a slam dunk would be existing MSBI customers who are just are not getting the query performance they need. I think that would be kind of the most obvious case where you've got everything set up and it wouldn't be too difficult to make the transition. Okay, so like I said, this is not a perfect solution. Who is it not ideal for? If you have just enormous data sizes, you've got hundreds of terabytes of data in your warehouse, it's going to be a challenge getting all that into memory, and it's even harder than it sounds right now, and I'll get into that a bit. If you need real-time reporting of large data sets, like I said, data processing just takes time, so this is not, the optimal solution for that. If you have hardware limitations, it's going to be a challenge for the reasons we talked about. You have to have enough RAM. Some people might have very small data sizes that would work with simpler tools. One of the tools I mentioned earlier was Microsoft's Power Pivot. Right in Excel, you can import large data sizes, or not large, but you can import data, and it will actually create a tabular cube on your machine that you can query. It's fast. It obviously doesn't have the security built in, so it's not necessarily an enterprise class solution, but if all you need is a power analyst to grab data from here and there, this might be overkill. And then if you're looking at analyzing non-structured data, really this is a tool for kind of a traditional star schema, database solution. So I wouldn't say it's at all ideal for people in the non-structured space. Okay, so what were some of the observations having stood this up? So I think back to one client I had. It was a large media company based on the East Coast, and they were using OLAP cubes, and they worked really well for 95% of what they wanted to do when they first got started. But then they realized they had a need for some more granular reports, and they had one where when they tried to grab all the elements they needed and include it in the report, it would literally time out. It just wouldn't come back. They couldn't do the analysis. So we decided to spin up a tabular environment. It was the same exact data, and the report they needed came back in under 2 minutes. And that was the first time I really saw this tool can do something. This is something that is definitely this is going to change things. More recently, we had a project where a SQL developer who had never touched tabular cubes before was able to stand up a tabular database and didn't really have any special training except for some guidance from us. And where the guidance came was on the DAX side. We had to provide the DAX patterns for some of the time intelligence and some of the complicated calculations, but in terms of just dealing with the user interface and getting it deployed, especially if you have a Microsoft background, it's fairly familiar and straightforward. And on that same project, we had database administrators that are supporting the system. They didn't have any special training and were able to do all the support that was needed. There was no extra configuration that was required. It was very straightforward. So I think, the benefits are easy to observe. So what do you need to know if you're going to set one of these up? Where do you start? Well, the first place you need to start is your hardware considerations. You're going to have to know that you're going to need significant RAM. One of the things that I want to highlight is that, in a lot of cases, you can add additional CPUs, and that can help depending on your system. But really, it's speed of CPUs that can make a big difference here. When we talked about that processing pain, fast CPUs can definitely help to alleviate that. And there's going to be some level of testing required to understand your hardware requirements. It might make sense to spin up a cloud server and see what the compression levels are and see what it's really going to take so you can size a little bit better. So that's where I begin. The second thing, and I'm really going to make this a highlight of the presentation, is this DAX language. It's very, very different from MDX and SQL, and what we found is, contrary to what Microsoft is saying in the marketplace, people aren't picking it up quickly. It does require special training. I didn't see anyone who said, oh, this is intuitive, this makes sense, and then just ran with it. They had to take time and effort into learning this language to really be able to harness all of the value of tabular cubes. So I think anyone embarking on a project is going to need to, take that into account. And then, particularly if you're coming from an OLAP background, the general design approach is very different from OLAP cubes. You're thinking in terms of tables and columns, which is nice, but you can't leverage a lot of the kind of native hierarchical functions that you had in OLAP. You have to push more down to the ETL level or the view level in terms of getting a lot of the business logic that you may have been able to do in the modeling tool before. So let's talk about general design considerations. You've decided this is the right tool for us. We've got the hardware we need. Now what do I need to take into consideration to make this as easy as possible? The first I would say is partitioning. So we talked about, and this is the second point, how processing can take a long time. So you can partition your data, just like you could in OLAP, to be able to only process sections of tables that have changed. But it's not going to give you benefits beyond that. In an OLAP environment, you can partition your data, and it will actually help query performance. That's not the case. But partitioning is still critical because you have to try to get those processing times down as low as you can. So you're going to want to spend a little bit of time in your project doing that, and it takes some testing. And it takes some investigation. You might need to determine if your facts have open periods that are getting new data and closed periods that aren't touched. It can allow you to process less data on a nightly basis, but that's something that needs to be taken into account. And as I mentioned before, you're really probably going to push more of your logic down to the ETL and the views than you would for dimensional modeling. So you're going to work with your developers a little bit on that. All right. That was what I wanted to cover there. Now let's look at the tool. All right, so I talked a little bit about the DAX language. So right now I'm going to show you some DAX. This is a tool called DAX Studio. It's maintained by the user community. You can get it. Well, I'll actually have Allison send out the link. I highly recommend this tool for developing in DAX. It has IntelliSense. It has query formatting. It has all sorts of information you can get about your query. Let's see. I can highlight over an attribute, and it will tell me what the data type is, which is important because for string in DAX you've got to use double quotes, etc. But you'll notice that the DAX language itself is a little bit different from SQL. It starts with an evaluate statement, which you can think of as the equivalent of a select statement. Pretty different. And it has a summarize function there, and that's different as well. You could think of that as a group by in SQL. And then I'm going to explicitly mention a fact table and then some columns that I want. So it's, as you can see from its layout, it's different, it's new, and it's not SQL. So I definitely would advise people who think, oh, I know SQL, I've been writing SQL my whole life, I'll pick this up instantly. We've not found that to be the case, despite what Microsoft might say. So I talked about it being fast. Let's do this. Let's create a new session. And let's get started. So what I've done is I've taken one of the AdventureWorks databases that you can get from Codeplex. I think it might be on GitHub now. It's a good way if you just kind of want to play with some of Microsoft's technologies. You can get this database. It's based off data from a fictional bicycle shop, which is kind of fun. And what I did is I simply added lots of fact records to it so that it would be big enough to be able to demonstrate some query degradation. So as you can see, we've got this number here, and I'm going to go into SQL Server Management Studio, which SQL Server developers will be intimately familiar with, and we're going to write a query. This is a DAX query against an OLAP cube that has the identical underlying data. And to show you that I'm not trying to trick anyone, we're going to start, there's that sales amount. It's identical to what we have with our tabular query. And what I want to do is just start slicing it. So this is the MDX language. And initially, it might look similar to SQL, but really, it's a language all its own, and there's quite a learning curve associated with this. And Microsoft was saying when they first came out with Tabular that people were going to pick up DAX a lot faster than they were going to pick up MDX. I haven't found that to be the case at all. To me, the learning curve is very comparable. Now, building the cubes and kind of working with them in the interface, Tabular is definitely easier. But just learning the language itself, I wouldn't say it's much of an improvement. So let's start to add some attributes so that we can see what happens to performance. So as you can see in the lower right-hand corner, that took 1 second. Pretty acceptable performance. I'm going to add currency, and it's still just at 1 second. So let's start to add more. And this is where traditionally OLAP technologies would see serious performance degradation. You'll notice that this is not a conventional query in that I don't have a date filter. I'm using this just for the purposes of demonstration, but it's effective all the same. Okay, so let's add actually just first name. Still at 1 second, not bad. Last name. It's going to take a little bit longer. It took 5 seconds. So still fairly fast, but not as fast as it started out. Let's do the same with our tabular cube using DAX. All right, we'll look at our results. Hold on just 1 second. Oh, I found just one little issue. Can't have a demo unless you have some surprises. Okay, so sorry about that.
Just proves it's real.
It's yeah. This was not scripted. You got to keep even yourself honest sometimes. And you can see down here that it came back in a fraction of a second. Let's go back to our OLAP cube and let's add the description of the product. And when I built this OLAP cube, I did a little bit of performance tuning. I added some aggregations, but I didn't do any server level performance tuning. So I'm sure we could get this faster if I took some more time, but this is real in terms of just how much faster Tabular can be. So that took 7 seconds. Let's go back. Let's add the description. And as you can see, it came back instantly. So I could continue to do this. You'd continue to see degradation, but as you can see, much, much faster. And I didn't have to do anything to tune it. That's the takeaway here. It's fast and setting it up was easy. So speaking of setting it up, let's kind of take a look at what that looks like. All right. So we have this interface. And I'm going to delete a little calculation that we can add back just so we can see what it looks like. It's Visual Studio. It's data tools. It'll be familiar with a lot of Microsoft developers. The layout to create relationships is fairly intuitive. You can right-click and you can set up a relationship. The layout's intuitive in that it has most of the Visual Studio ribbon options that you're used to, you'll see a couple new ones. One is the model. That's anything at the database level you want to change. So take something like security, or just like OLAP, you can add perspectives to expose just a portion of the cube if you like, to maybe certain departments that only need a little bit. Or maybe you've got a huge cube and you want to release a little bit at a time so that people can learn it. And you have table options where you can modify table properties. You can do partitions like we talked about. It's all relatively limited, and it's all relatively intuitive. So let's go in and let's look at a specific table. So here I have my fact tables. You can see the columns. I can specify if I want it to appear in client tools. For something like a foreign key, obviously, I wouldn't want users to see that, but for something like a measure, I certainly would, and that's what you see here. And let's do a little more DAX. Let's create a calculation. So here what I'm going to do, just for demonstration purposes, is I'm going to just write some DAX that's going to filter our data, and in this case, it's just going to exclude a portion of the data based on one of my attributes. So to write one of these calculations, in the table there's this grid, and in any cell in a grid, you simply type in what you want your name to be, a colon, a equals, and then I'm going to start with the calculate statement. So again, pretty unfamiliar to SQL developers, and that's a station, or excuse me, it's a function that is set up to introduce a filter. So I have my calculate statement, and the first argument I'm going to have is a measure expression, which in this case is going to be internet total sales. Next, I'm going to write a function called filter, and this is, if you're familiar with OLAP cubes, you can maybe think of this as being comparable to a tuple, kind of a where clause in SQL, but it has kind of a different functionality, certainly a different syntax. So first I need to specify a table, which in this case is going to be sales territory. Then I'm going to specify a column. So I'm going to go to my sales territory table. I'm going to find the country. And I'm going to say simply not equal to Australian, unlike SQL and DAX. You need double quotes. All right, so I've got my calculation. I'm going to enter it in here. It does a little bit of validation. Then I'm simply going to deploy it, and let's look at it. Okay. So let's use Excel. I talked about that being the kind of the preferred ad hoc interface, and we've definitely noticed that analysts love it because they're in Excel all day. They're already good at Excel. They like Excel. So I'm going to connect to the database. I am going to get internet total sales. We'll grab this. We'll grab the one we just created. You'll notice it's not formatted. I'll show you how to do that. And then let's just slice this by a hierarchy that I can demonstrate for you. Let's go and find the territory hierarchy. And I'll pull that on. And as you can see, Australia is excluded from our calculation. So it was fairly straightforward to do, but the DAX was definitely unfamiliar to someone who's not been using it for a while, and that's kind of the point I want to make. The next point I want to make is it's fairly simple, but a little bit limited to modify these attributes. So if you've ever seen an OLAP cube, you've got tons and tons of different options here on its properties. This attribute's properties is fairly limited. In this case, I'm just going to set it to be a currency data type. I'll redeploy it. And just like that, we've got our currency. So various elements of this really are as easy as promised. So let's conclude. As you saw, query performance and as I mentioned, administration, it really is what Microsoft says. This is a revelation compared to its predecessor technologies. As you saw, the development interface was intuitive, but it does require DAX knowledge. And DAX has a real learning curve, and departments need to have project time and budget for training. Otherwise, they're not going to have the most successful project they can. Take that into account. Take it from me. And then, depending on SLA requirements and data sizing, project time and budget needs to be allocated for processing optimization. If you have just tons and tons of RAM, you can process 15 cubes in parallel. If you don't have that much RAM, you might have to process your cubes in serial. This is something that your architecture really going to have to take into account. It might take some time, and you might have to adjust as your data sizes grow and as you add new databases. So if you remember nothing else, other than this is a really, really fast tool, remember that you need a lot of RAM to make it happen. So one last piece before we go into QA is I'm going to send out, or I'll have Allison send out some really helpful links. The first one is just a feature list that'll say, what does this have? Does it support custom assemblies? Does it support actions and so on? It's very crisp and concise, and I think it's a perfect place to start. The second is a link to an article on msbi.com, or SQLBI.com rather, and this is a great resource. I talked about how resources were kind of scarce for this. This is the place you should start. It's got a couple of experts, Marco Russo and Alberto Ferrari, who literally wrote the book on DAX, and it's just I think the absolute best resource for developers. The second thing that the third thing that I wanted to share, Microsoft has a performance tuning white paper, and it covers a lot of really good partitioning strategies to get your processing time down as low as possible. So I would say that's something that you should definitely spend some time with when you're setting up your environment. And then finally, like I said, we'll have a link to DAX Studio.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Greg. Let's get right to the Q&A. We really appreciate the presentation. I think we've had some really good questions come in. One of the first ones is, can you give an example of the kinds of extra ETL that might be required for tabular versus OLAP?
Thanks for the question. That's actually a really good one. So again, it might be ETL or it might be putting logic into views, but let's say there were functions that you had based on calendars before that you could program kind of dynamically into DAX. You may need to move that to the database layer. And that's just something that we found was easier and more straightforward. It'll vary by implementation, but you cannot use you can't use the dimensional model and the hierarchies to get your calculations. You have to jump around based on columns that you add to a table.
Great, thank you, Greg. This next question, thank you for this question, Mr. Conway. It may be a little bit longer in explanation, but can you speak to aggregation, custom assemblies, custom roll-up, man-to-many limitations of tabular versus multidimensional OLAP cubes? So it's really 4 questions rolled into one. So if you need me to, read it again after you make your first pass at the answer, happy to do that.
Thank you. Another good question. So to clarify, there's no concept of an aggregation in a tabular cube. An aggregation was something that you would add. You could think of it like an index. It's structurally it's different than an index. It's literally what it says. It's sort of rolled up data, and that was how you would performance tune your queries in an OLAP environment. That step is removed, so you literally don't have to do that anymore. When it comes to custom assemblies, at this time, they're simply not supported. I can speak to that. And in terms of many-to-many relationships, you can't. There isn't native support for many-to-many relationships, like there was in OLAP, where you can define the relationship using the user interface inside the tool. But there are ways that you can implement many relationships using DAX calculations, and I've actually included that in the list that Allison is going to send out. As far as rollups, I will send a. I'll have Allison include a good link on that. And then hierarchies, you can set up hierarchies, but it's different when it comes to things like custom dates. If you want to do something like a customized fiscal date, you're going to have to have columns supporting that, and you're going to have special DAX calculations that are involved. And it's not quite as elegant as it was in the OLAP world, where because the structure itself was hierarchical, you could just program it, to go up, to its ancestor and so on. It's a little bit more involved. That was kind of the main thing that we noticed. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Greg. Next question, is this somewhat analogous to TM1?
This is Matt Caton. I can speak to that question. TM1 regarding Cognos, I assume you're asking about, and as far as the underlying technology goes with in-memory capabilities, they're really, for lack of a better term, different strokes for different folks. The TM1 approach is obviously very specific to planning and budgeting and whatnot, whereas Tabular is a lot more open-ended. So underlying technology-wise, I can't speak directly to if Tabular or if TM1 is using a similar in-memory engine, but the tools are definitely meant for some different business purposes.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. Appreciate you jumping in. Thank you so much for that. We're going to take one more question, and then we're going to wrap things up. And actually, this was a question that I also had in my mind, so I'm glad that someone asked it. They wanted to know how many rows were in the source AW table.
That's a good question. And I also wanted to know that, so I checked this morning, and I think I still have the query up. Let's see. $1.3 million.
Excellent. Okay. For the remaining questions that we weren't able to get to, we will be answering those via email. Several people asked if the slides would be available, and the answer is yes. However, we don't send the slides out. What we do is we have recorded this session, and we will make that available on our website. So if you want to see it again, if you want to share that link with a peer, you certainly can. So next slide, please. Okay, let's go ahead and wrap things up. I'd like to invite all of you personally to come join us for our next educational series. It's BI in the cloud. And as you know, there is, with so many companies, every company I think I talked to, they've got a cloud initiative, whether it's, a hybrid of on-prem and cloud or a complete cloud migration, but it's certainly at the top of mind for so many people. So that's going to be on Thursday, March 8th. And it's going to be presented by Matt Caton, who you heard from a little bit earlier today. So Matt, I'm looking right at Matt. Matt, we're excited about that. So with that, let's conclude. Thank you, everyone, for your time. I know how valuable it is. And look for the link. Anyone who attended will receive the link to this recorded session. And Greg, thank you so much. It was very educational. We really appreciate you pulling this together.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.